At 89 years old, she was doing something that shouldn't have been happening. She was still getting better. She had learned to play chess after turning 70, and she was still developing new strategies. That afternoon, she was beating her grandson through strategy, not luck. She remembered his games, his patterns, the mistakes he kept making, and she used all of it with remarkable precision. Her grandson was 34 years old. He was a software engineer. He lost. There's a story almost all of us have heard about aging, that the brain slowly goes into decline. But one group of researchers spent nearly 3 decades studying people who seemed to challenge that story. People in their 80s, even 90s. And when they tested memory, attention, and processing speed, the results looked like they belonged to someone decades younger. Not just a little better than expected for their age, comparable to adults in their 50s. The question was no longer why some people grow older. The question became, why do some people seem to age in a completely different way? The person who reaches 80 and still makes quick mental connections, still remembers the name they just heard, still changes their mind when presented with a better argument, and the person who starts repeating the same stories at 65, who stops in the middle of a sentence because they lose their train of thought, who seems present but always about a second behind, the same age, completely different outcomes. Why? Researchers at Northwestern began investigating exactly that 25 years ago, and what they found challenges almost everything people assume about how the brain ages, because the answer isn't where most people think it is. Most people assume super-agers simply have something everyone else doesn't: better genetics, more education, more disciplined routines. Research shows those factors do exist, but they aren't what separates this group. When researchers at Northwestern analyzed the brains of super-agers, first with brain imaging during life, then through post-mortem studies over a span of 25 years, they found something they weren't expecting. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in emotion, attention, and decision-making, was thicker in super-agers than in many adults decades younger. And this is where things become truly counterintuitive. Within that same region is a rare type of nerve cell called the von Economo neuron. Researchers believe these cells are involved in the way we process emotions and social connection. For example, how you can sense when a conversation feels genuine instead of performative. In people with typical cognition, the number of these cells barely changes with age. It remains remarkably stable throughout life. But in super-agers, researchers found 3 to 5 times more of these cells than in people of the same age with typical cognitive function, even more than in many younger adults. The density of these cells doesn't normally increase with age, except apparently in theirs. If that sounds strange, a type of cell that should remain stable yet appears in much greater numbers among super-agers, it may be because science spent decades measuring the wrong thing, looking for what the brain was losing instead of what it was preserving. Researchers still don't know whether these individuals were born with more of these cells or whether something about the way they lived protected them from a decline that most people experience. But the post-mortem findings revealed something else. In that same brain region, super-agers had between 87% and 92% fewer tau tangles, the protein associated with Alzheimer's disease, than age-matched controls. The question is no longer, what did these brains lose more slowly? It's, what did these brains preserve, or perhaps have from the very beginning, that most people never had? But there's another fascinating detail. When researchers first began this work, they expected to find an explanation that was primarily biological: better genes, greater protection against disease, perhaps some rare mechanism that science hadn't yet discovered. And part of the answer really was inside the brain, but not all of it. Because the longer they followed these people, the more they realized that something outside the brain seemed to matter too. That clue kept showing up in conversations, in daily routines, in relationships. It would take years before they fully understood what they were seeing. There's something fascinating about how this research began. For decades, scientists focused primarily on cognitive decline. Everything changed when researchers at Northwestern started asking a different question. What happens to people who reach their 80s and 90s without significant cognitive decline? It would take more than 2 decades to answer that question systematically. And the answer turned out to be far more surprising than they had imagined. Most people who reach their 60s begin paying closer attention to their own cognition. You remember something and think, I used to remember that faster. You search for a word and it doesn't come right away. You walk into a room and have to reconstruct why you went there. And there's an almost automatic tendency to interpret those moments as a sign that the clock has started ticking. What the research shows is that part of that fear is justified, and part of it isn't. The brain does change after 60. That's real. Some functions become slower. Working memory, the system that holds information temporarily while you're using it, can become more variable. But those changes aren't uniform, and they aren't inevitable to the degree most people assume. What determines the trajectory doesn't appear to be aging by itself. It's a combination of factors that begin working decades earlier. And super-agers are the clearest example science has documented so far. So here's what super-ager research still hasn't fully answered. If there's a group of people who reach 90 with brains functioning like someone in their 60s, what was different about them in the decades before that? And did they even know they were doing it? One of the participants researchers followed was over 80 years old. She still managed her own finances, still drove herself, still remembered appointments without relying on constant reminders. When researchers asked what kept her so mentally engaged, she didn't mention supplements. She didn't mention brain training exercises. She didn't mention any particular diet. She gave a much simpler answer. I stay curious about people. It's an easy answer to overlook, but it points toward one of the most interesting discoveries in this entire line of research. There's a window. The brain that reaches 80 doesn't suddenly appear at 80. It's built over the decades that come before. Longitudinal studies, following the same people over many years, show that the patterns associated with accelerated cognitive decline rarely appear overnight. They build up quietly, sometimes for 10 or 15 years, before any noticeable symptoms appear. This isn't a reason to panic, it's a reason to pay attention. Because the same principle works in the opposite direction. The patterns associated with maintaining cognitive health also accumulate over time. The difference is that almost no one talks about what those patterns actually are. There is one factor that consistently appears in super-agers, not when researchers look at their brains, but when they look at the way they lived. And it isn't any of the things the wellness industry usually tries to sell. Science already understood what was happening inside the brains of super-agers. But what changed everything was when researchers began looking outside the brain, at the way these people lived. Because when researchers tried to identify what these people had in common, the most consistent factor wasn't regular exercise. It wasn't income, it wasn't education, and it wasn't any particular diet. It was relationships, people, conversations, human connections. Super-agers were noticeably more social. They reported more positive relationships, and they consistently scored higher on one specific personality trait, extroversion. That doesn't mean introverts are somehow doomed. The researchers themselves are careful about interpreting those findings. But there's something that's difficult to ignore. The brain region best preserved in super-agers was the very region most deeply involved in emotion, attention, and social processing, almost as if the brain was preserving the systems that continued to be used. The exact cause is still being investigated, but the connection is too strong to simply dismiss. Remember the 89-year-old woman playing chess with her grandson? She learned to play chess at 74 after retiring because, as she put it, she needed something that made her feel stupid again, and she didn't play alone. She played with her grandson. Two things at the same time: a genuine cognitive challenge and a relationship that required real presence. That combination matters more than it may seem. There's another body of research from a different field known as cognitive reserve that points in a similar direction. Continuously challenging the brain appears to help keep neural networks active, even though that specific relationship hasn't yet been isolated within the Northwestern SuperAging group itself. This is where modern life comes into direct conflict with what the science is suggesting. Much of today's technology is designed to eliminate cognitive effort. GPS, so you don't have to remember directions. Algorithms, so you don't have to make choices. Summaries, so you don't have to read the entire article. This isn't proof of cause and effect. It's a reasonable hypothesis that's still evolving. But it's a hypothesis worth taking seriously, because the cost of testing it is almost zero. The strongest finding, however, remains this: genuine social connection appears to be one of the factors most consistently associated with maintaining sharp cognition well into your 90s. Not necessarily having more friends, but having relationships that are emotionally engaging, the kind of conversations where you truly have to listen, and sometimes even change your mind. So what does all of this mean in practical terms? First, invest in relationships that ask something of you. Not comfortable relationships, relationships that challenge the way you think, the person who disagrees with you intelligently, the group where you're not the most experienced person in the room, the conversation you actually have to prepare for. Among super-agers, this kind of social engagement wasn't a luxury. It was one of the most consistent patterns researchers found. Second, start seeing cognitive effort as an investment, not as a warning sign. When something feels difficult, when you get stuck, when you want to give up, that isn't necessarily your brain telling you to stop. It may be your brain being challenged. And there's an emerging body of research suggesting that's exactly where part of the brain's maintenance work takes place. A practical example: learn something that temporarily makes you feel incompetent. A new language, a musical instrument, a strategy game, a field of knowledge completely outside your own. Third, don't outsource every cognitive decision you're still capable of making. Don't rely on GPS every single time. Don't settle for a 3-line summary when you could read the whole thing. This isn't nostalgia for the analog world. It's about actively exercising the neural networks you want to preserve. One important note: these patterns emerge from studies that followed groups of people over decades. Every brain follows its own path, shaped by genetics, health history, and many factors beyond any individual's control. If you have specific concerns about your cognition, talking with your physician or a neurologist should be your first step, not this video. What this video offers is the broader picture of what the research is finding, and in many ways, that picture is more hopeful than the standard narrative about cognitive aging. Super-agers didn't outsmart aging by accident, but they didn't follow a strict protocol either. What the evidence consistently suggests is that they lived in ways that continually demanded something from them, emotionally, socially, and sometimes cognitively. Not because they avoided comfort, but because they never seemed to confuse comfort with growth. The 89-year-old woman didn't play chess to keep her brain healthy. She played because she enjoyed being challenged, and because she was playing with someone she loved. There's no way to know today exactly what your brain will look like at 85. No study can promise that. But the research suggests something important. Maybe the question isn't, how do I protect my brain? Maybe the better question is, am I living in a way that continues to ask something of it? Because super-agers didn't seem to spend their lives trying to avoid aging. They kept participating in life. They kept learning. They kept connecting. They kept caring. And perhaps that's the most fascinating discovery of all. The brain doesn't seem to thrive simply because it's protected. It seems to thrive when it continues to be used for something that truly matters. Science shows that social connection isn't a luxury. It's part of the architecture that supports the brain. Exactly how meaningful relationships reshape our biology is what we'll explore in the next video here on the Second Half Blueprint. If you'd like to continue this conversation without shortcuts or magic formulas, subscribe to the channel. The next video is already on your screen.